Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the PETRA-E conference 2021. I'm so glad that you could join us today, and especially because today we're hearing from Antonio Toral for our first keynote speech. And he's going to be talking to us about his area of expertise, which is machine-aided literary translation, and especially focusing on the state of affairs in the early 2020s. So without any further ado, I'll hand straight over to Antonio. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, James. Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks for the kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. Once, because this is a topic that I really enjoy, machine translation applied to literary texts. And second, because even if virtually, I'm coming back to the city where I started working on this. So I started working on this topic when I was at Dublin City University with Andy Way. Yeah, I am to give you an overview of machine translation applied to literary text, the work that has been done in the last seven years or so, and also some ideas of what could be done in the future, in my view. Before I start, I want to introduce some abbreviations, because I will be talking about having this in the slides. I think it'll be easier to understand. So I'll be talking about 3 translation types throughout. So human translation from scratch. This is without machine translation or a translation memory. PE post-editing. So human translation working with a starting point and machine translation outputs, and empty for raw machine translation. So I'll be talking about these 3 possibilities. I'll be showing you examples in different languages. So here, I'll just for brevity, I have the ISO codes. So I have examples in Catalan, English, Spanish, French, and so on. And I'll be talking about 2 types of machine translation systems. So the first one is SMT, Statistical, which is the previous state of the art. And the other one is NMT, Neural, which is the current state of the art. And one another thing before we start, I want to give you a really high level overview, short, about machine translation systems or data-driven systems. So both statistical and neural are data-driven systems. So I won't go into any details, but just the basics of what data we use for these systems. So let's imagine here in the center, we see the empty system, which is a black box. We consider it as a black box. And it's going to receive an input sentence, say in English, for example, and it's going to translate it and produce an output sentence, hopefully a good translation in another language. What is important for us for this presentation is what we use to train this system. So we use 2 kinds of data. The first one is parallel data. So this is sentence pairs. So we'll have ideally millions of sentences in English on one side and the human translations on the language we want to translate into. And we also can have monolingual data, so just data for the target language. And this is bigger, as you can see, than the parallel data, because usually, of course, it's easier to find more of this. So with this parallel and monolingual data, basically we build a system that then can translate. Okay, so now we can start. So I will start with an introduction, which is basically a motivation. So why machine translation? Why apply machine translation to literary texts now? I think we need to motivate this. And then I will go for the 3 main elements or actors I think we have to consider. The first one is the machine. So what can we do in machine translation to train machine translation systems for literary texts? The second actor is the human translator, and here is going to be about how can a human translator interact with a literary empty system. And finally, the third actor is the reader, because in the end we produce translations that someone is going to read. So what is the resulting performance of these translations in the sense of what do readers think about them. Okay, so I'll present you some work, not only work by me and my collaborators, but also work by others along these three actors. And finally, some summary and ideas for future work. Okay, so let's start with the motivation. So basically, we have here two translation pipelines. In the bottom, we have the translation pipeline that is common. Just a second. Yes, at the bottom, we have the pipeline that is common in the literary translation, I think. So this is a source document. And then a translator is going to translate this. So that translator is going to use some tools like maybe dictionaries and so on, but not the internet, but not a machine translation system. So what we experiment with is adding something in this pipeline, which is here. This is an empty system. So now the source document first goes through an empty system, and then the translator works not on an empty translation, but starts from the empty output. So this is post-editing. So we're going to compare these two pipelines. Okay, so I'll start the motivation here with ebooks. So why do empty for literary text now? The one is the emergence of the ebook. So these are digital books. So we have access to books that are originals and their translations in digital format. So it's straightforward to derive from this parallel data. This is thanks to ebooks, we can train literary adaptive systems, let's say easily somewhat. And this is actually what made me start in this line of research. So some years ago, I was working on collecting data for empty systems, and in the empty community, normally we do this from the web. So we crawl, we try to find websites that contain data in more than one language. Then we try to find which web page pairs, align them, and that way we get data. So I started looking at ebooks, and I found, well, this is way easier to get data from ebooks than from the web. And the translation quality is very good because these are published translations. So this is high quality human translations. So I started looking at, can I build a system from these ebooks? It was more than anything curiosity. Okay, the second reason, again, has to do with empty, is the emergence of a new paradigm, which maybe you have heard about. This is neural machine translation that started really becoming, it was clear that something big was happening around 2015, I think. So compared to the previous architecture, statistical, this neural offers a considerably better empty quality. And there are two main things here. So the first one is that it generalizes. While statistical systems work with text strings, neural can go a bit deeper and work with, let's say, concepts to some extent. So it can generalize. And the second is fluency. While statistical was working with chunks of 1 to 5 consecutive words, neural is capable of modeling a whole sentence at once, and therefore it's much more fluent. While with statistical, sometimes you get the feeling of sequences of 1 to 5 words stick together, but the whole thing doesn't really sound that fluent. Okay, so this has improved empty quality to the point that there are some discussion in the empty community that any neural machine translation may have reached human parity. This is some people in the community claim that for some language pairs and textual domains, neural MTs would be at the level of a professional human translator. There are also others in the community, including me, that have been refuting these claims. And in this claiming and refuting claims, what I think is that the community has improved the way we evaluate our machine translation systems. And also we have become aware of some concepts from translation studies that we were maybe disregarding before. Okay, now I move to the next element in the pipeline. So here will be the human translator. And the thing here is that there is post-editing is a well-established practice nowadays. So the figure I show here is a famous study and is already 11 years old. And already back then they show that for technical translation, post-editing results in considerable increases in translation productivity. Okay, so now I'll move to the first of the three actors, and I'll go one by one. So the first one is the machine. And the question I had here is, how far can machine translation go on literary texts? Some people actually look at this previous to the emergence of neural MT, so in the statistical MT days. And the first paper I want to mention is, that by Besacier and Schwartz, 2015. So they translated a short story from English into French. They use a generic empty system, so not trained on literary texts, but on news and general domain, let's say. And post-editing was done by non-professional translators. Okay, so if we put all these pieces together, I think we can expect that it's not going to be that good, right? So you have statistical machine translation, not neural, generic system, and post-editing by non-professionals. And indeed, the quality was not that good, but they mentioned in their paper that this could be a useful low-cost alternative, of course, with lower translation quality. And they mentioned this would be an equivalent of the fan sub movement, so subtitles translated by fans, but for literary texts. At the time, with my then supervisor Andy Way, we tried something similar, but knowing or taking into account the limitations of statistical systems, we went for a closely related language pair, so Spanish, Catalan in this case. So we thought for such a closely related language pair, in any case, much of the translation is going to be quite literal, so maybe it's going to work to some extent. So what we did, we wanted to translate a novel by Ruiz Zafón. So we had an empty system that we adapted on previous novels by this author and their translations into Catalan. So we adapted this system to Zafón, let's say. And then we gave the translations to two native speakers, and we asked them how you feel the quality is. So they saw the human translation and the machine translation. And the result was that they were considered of equivalent quality for 60% of the sentences. Okay, now we move to Neural MT days. So when Neural MT emerged, we thought, okay, let's go to less related languages and see what happens. So now we move from Spanish Catalan to English Catalan, where of course you can translate literally way less in this pair. So we collected a lot of data and we trained a system that was trained only on literary data. So we had 133 parallel novels, so novels in English with their human translations in Catalan, and 1,000 novels in Catalan. So this all in all leads to around 5 million sentences, and we did automatic evaluation on 12 books and human on 3 books. Okay, so I'm showing you now here an overview of the automatic evaluation. So first I want to talk a bit about the books. So we try to have a set of 12 books that are kind of representative. So we have books from the 1920s, 1930s up to the early 2000s. Things that are considered more high literature, like Joyce's Ulysses, for example, to recent bestsellers, such as Hunger Games, which would be young adult fiction, or yeah, other classics like The Catcher in the Rye, Harry Potter. So a lot of different things. And we evaluate with something called the blue score. And this is basically if you take sequences of 1 to 4 consecutive words, how many match between the empty outputs and the human translation we compare against. So we are comparing against the human translation that was published in the target language. So this overlap could be from 0, no sequence of words match, to 1, everything matches. Of course, one is not, let's say, achievable because there are different ways of translating, and all the ways could be fine, right? So anyway, what we see is we have results for statistical and neural. We see two things. One is regardless of the book, neural MT is better, so the translation quality is better. You can see the red line is always goes further than the blue one. And the other thing is that there is a huge variety in translation quality. So we can see, for example, for the recent bestseller I mentioned, Hunger Games, it's around almost 40% of overlap, while Joyce's Ulysses, as we might have expected, is way lower, around less than 20%. So neural MT always improves, but there is a huge variety and depending on what kind of novel we're talking about. So overall, the improvement is 11%, but we'll see later what this means. Yeah, when we give it to readers, for example. Okay, something I always like to mention is that neural MT is not something that came and that's it. It's a paradigm that also evolves, and there are different architectures, for example. So the red line, the first one I presented, I call this version 1, which is the first architecture that was successful. And here version 2 is the second such architecture that was successful. So the first one was introduced in 2014 and the second one in 2017. So when we train the same models with a new neural architecture, we see that we get a further and another improvement. So inside neural, things are evolving, and there is progress being made as well. So you can see that the level of improvement is actually similar to going from statistical to neural version 1 and from neural version 1 to neural version 2. Maybe you are noticing here something strange with Oster Sunset Park, which there is here quite a regression. And when I went and looked at this book, it contains really long sentences. And this is a problem for machine translation. And I'll be talking later a bit about this. Okay. Maybe I will show you not only numbers, but also some real examples of translations. So this is English to Catalan, and if you know maybe Spanish or French or Italian, I think you'll be able to follow. And in any case, I'm going to go one by one explaining what is going on here. So we have here okay, we have here the source. This is the English sentence, human translation by a professional translator, and two of our systems. The first one we built in 2017 and the second one in 2020. So I'll show you a few examples. Here in yellow, you see the part of the sentence I'm going to focus on. So the first one is, there were great advantages to being unimportant. If we now move to the first empty system, so an empty version 1, y había grandes avantajes de ser sense importancia, literally, there were great advantages of being without importance. So you see, it's very literal. It's almost word by word, and it doesn't really sound fluent in the target language. We move to the second, what the second system produces, and this, la manca de importancia tenía grandes avantajes. The lack of importance had great advantages. So we see that this system has turn around the sentence, so it's capable of going beyond word by word, and is actually changing the syntactic constituents. And if we now look at what the human translator did, is quite similar. So ser poco important, being not that important, teníamos avantajes, had big advantages. So we see the structure of the second empty system is similar, has changed quite a bit from the source text, and is quite similar to what the professional translator did. Second sentence, he would inherit the throne. This is a simple, short, simple sentence. And we see in this case, the three translations are exactly the same. Él heredaría el trono. He would inherit the throne. So word by word, literal. So when it's a simple sentence that can be translated word by word, then of course it doesn't make much of a difference. Third one, if we keep the treaty, they will still strike. Okay, so strike here, if we look at the first system, farán vaga, this is a problem of mistranslation. This is strike, but in a sense of a union strike, not in a sense of a military strike. While the second system and the human translator get the right sense, atacarán, which is strike in the sense of a military attack. Okay, the fourth and last one, this is about gut feelings. So it's an expression, and we look at the first system, is translated gut and feelings, both words separately, one and then the other. And when you put this together, it doesn't make sense. The second system goes for something that is much better. So sentiments guturals, that's okay. But it's not maybe as creative as the human translation that says sensaciones internas, so internal feelings, we could say. Okay, so this was to give you a taste of what it means going from one in NMT from one architecture to the next one, and the result, the implications on the final translation. So then what we did was a human evaluation to see how readers perceive these translations. So this we did before having the second NMT. So this is what I'm showing here is NMT version 1 and SMT. So how we do this kind of evaluation is ranking. So here we are working with the catcher in the rye, by the way, and the reader is evaluating the sentence. This is about a goddamn baseball glove. And we give as context the previous and the next sentence. And they did this in sequence of longer passages, so they are aware of the maybe a bit more of context. And here we show them 3 translations. And we don't tell them what these translations come from, but they are. We just say there are 3 translations, rank them, which you think is better, or if you think 2 are equivalent, then give them the same rank. Okay, so when we have all the ranks, we can then compare this, and it turns out for statistical MT, in 80% of the cases, human was considered better than machine, and machine was considered at the level of human translation for around 20%. We move now to neural MT, and this 20% becomes 34%. So, of course, it's still quite low, but it's quite some progress compared to statistical machine translation. Okay. A question that still remains in this evaluation is, because we are evaluating our statistical system and our neural system, both trained on literary text, would be what about compared to generic systems, right? So we could just, why bother creating these systems when we could take Google or DeepL, for example? So now we evaluated our systems against Google. And we did this in terms of light post editing. So in this case, we are working with a short story from Sherlock Holmes. This is the yellow face. So we take the short story, and a translator has the translation by our system and by Google, and it's going to do light post editing. This means we don't go into style here, but just the minimal amount of changes so that the let's say, big errors are out of the way. Okay, so here we have Google is in blue, recurrent is our system NMT version 1, and transformer is our NMT version 2. And here we see percentage of sentences that would not require any changes, would require minimal post-editing, limited, moderate, considerable, and would need to be retranslated completely. And yeah, I think the findings are quite clear. If we see how many sentences do not require any post-editing, we see with Google is a bit less than 15%. Our literary adapted system version 1 is around 25, and our version 2 is higher than 45. So we see, at least for this language pair, it really pays off to build a literary adapted system. Okay. Next, maybe I'll look at data here. So here I'm giving an overview of the systems that I'm aware that have been built, literary adapted machine translation systems, and how much data they use. So we have our first one, 2018, for English Catalan, that had 1 million sentence pairs and 4 million sentences in the target language, and it took us 1 day, 1 full day to train. Kuzman et al. Is English Slovene. This had 2 million word pairs, so they provided this in terms of word pairs, so this might be around 100,000 sentence pairs, I think. Matusov did English German. In this case, they had general domain parallel data, and they adapted with monolingual data, so they had 10 million sentences of novels in German. Our revised system last year, here we add 5 million of general domain text, and this would take 3 days to train. And what we are working on now is on English Dutch, because we have more data, and of course I'm based in the Netherlands, so that makes sense. And here I'm working with, all in all, 25 million sentence pairs and 22 million sentences. And this would take more than 9 days. And this is in a specialized machine that will have a market value of 10,000 euro. So just to show you that it takes time for these systems to train. So the training these systems is not that technically difficult, because all the software in the community is publicly available and so on, but it still takes a lot of time to collect the data, prepare it, train, and so on. So maybe it's not surprising then that, there is many more works that use online empty systems, and they apply to literary text and see what happens, mostly DeepL and Google. And this, of course, makes sense because they're easily available, but there is a potential issue that I'd like to outline here, is that the text that is analyzed might be in its training data. So for example, if we take a classic, like say a Picture of Dorian Gray, and we translate it with Google, and then we look at what the empty system is doing, we cannot rule out that Google, that in the training data used to train this system, Google Translate, there is the Picture of Dorian Gray and the translation we are evaluating, in which case what we see in the empty system, of course, is better than it would be if had not seen this text. Okay, now I will have a short question for the audience, if that's okay. So I ask you to read these 2 translations. This is from a very famous French novel. So I give you 1 minute to read, and then I'll ask you a question. It's okay. Can we go with the question already? Yeah. Okay. So let me now share where I'm asking you the question. Yes, so now with your mobile phone, for example, you can go to menti.com and use this code, and then you can provide an answer like you prefer translation 1, you prefer translation 2, both are equally good, or both are equally bad. Okay, so I'll stop sharing so we don't see the answers. Okay. So I'll just wait a few more seconds and then we can discuss. Okay, I see 16 now, so maybe we can already show the results. Okay, interesting. So most people prefer translation 2. This is quite clear. And a few think they're both are good and a few both are bad, but clearly the winner is translation 2 here, right? Okay, so let's go back to the slides and see what is going on here. I think, okay, back to the slides. Yes, here. So maybe you might have thought that one is machine translation and the other human translation, but this is not the case. So both are human translations and you prefer the second one. So the first one is from 1946, is British English. The book is L'étranger, by the way. The first one is a British English translation and the second is American English. But I think here the main difference is not the English variety, but maybe the way of translating at the time, right? So you see the first one, the parts in orange are additions of the translator, right? This is not in the original, while the second one is more literal or faithful to the source text. So if now I put here the blue scores, so if I run Google Translate and compare, I see that the second one is much higher. So what I want to say with this is, depending on what is the translation we want to get to, using a machine translation system might make sense if you want to reach Word's solution, but not if you want to read Gilbert's solution. But you prefer translation 2. So this means post-editing might be a solution, might be viable, let's say. Okay, let's move to the human translator. So the question here is, can the machine be useful to assist professional literary translators? So now we have a system built. So can professional literary translators use this kind of system? Okay, so we have translation. The experiment we ran was on Wordbreaker, the novel. I show you a figure on the right side. And we have 3 conditions. So translators will work from scratch, post-editing neural MT, and post-editing statistical MT. We work with 6 professional literary translators, and they translated 1 chapter, which was 330 sentences. So they were working on consecutive tasks of 10 sentences. So maybe one translator did the first 10 sentences from scratch, the next 10 sentences post-editing statistical system, the next post-editing neural system, and so on. And what we measure was effort in 3 dimensions. So temporal effort, technical, and cognitive effort. This is the tool we use, which is not great in all aspects, but it measures, it logs all the key actions. So it's very good to analyze what is going on. So this is the from scratch condition. You see here there is a sentence in English and the box to enter the target translation is empty. This would be the equivalent post-editing conditions. So now we see the English sentence, and on the right-hand side, we see a translation. So the translator can post-edit this. Now I'm going to show you just temporal effort due to time limitation. So this is words per hour, and here we have the 6 translators. So we look, for example, at translator 2. We see that human translation from scratch, this translator would produce 600 words per hour. Post-editing the statistical system around 900, and post-editing the neural system, I don't know, 1100 or something. So there is a lot of variety of translators here. So the one I mentioned, translator 2, is one that is a young translator and does post-editing often, and we see that clearly here. At the other end of the spectrum, we have translator 6, which is a senior literary translator that hasn't ever done post-editing, hasn't ever used a cut tool, but still there is an increase in productivity. So we could see, regardless of the kind of translator, there was an increase in productivity, even if they were not familiar with this task. So overall, post-editing NMT led in our experiment to 36% increase in productivity. Okay. We, of course, asked them then what they thought. We don't want to see, are they faster and so on, but just how they felt about these tasks. So we can see only 2 had done post-editing before, so most of them were not familiar with this task. And when they asked them, which is your preferred translation methods, it was quite clear. They say, from scratch, my priority is to guarantee maximum quality. Post-editing NMT if I'm thinking about productivity. When we compare post-editing and human translation, again, maybe not surprising here, they say post-editing conditions you, makes you a bit lazy because you tend towards, as the task progresses, to accept more and more from the empty system. But at the same time, it can give you some inspiration and ideas. While with human translation, they said it's less constrained, you can be more creative. Comparing the 2 types of MT, they say, well, NMT is much better on complicated sentences and it sounds natural. About the tool we gave them, of course, yeah, they didn't like it because mainly this sentence by sentence, as you see in the boxes. So they say give you a fragmented vision and you are kind of forced to map one-to-one the sentences, while the target language tends to use longer sentences. In this regard, we told them you can merge sentences, but of course the tool doesn't, while you can do it, the tool is not designed for this. And the question that was the most important for me was whether a reader would notice the difference between post-editing and from scratch. And they said the average bestseller probably wouldn't, but the reader that values creativity and style probably would notice. Okay, so let's move then to the last actor in our pipeline, which is the reader. So here we had 3 questions. The first one is if we want to see whether post-editing and human translations make an effect, the first thing that we can look is, are they different, right? So we can analyze post-edits and human translations and see are they similar or not. The second, maybe for literary translation, especially important, creativity. So we want to measure how creative these 2 types of translations are. And finally, we go and work with the readers themselves and we check whether it affects their reading experience. So for the first question, what we did was to analyze post-edits and human translations quantitatively in terms of translationist principles, right? So it's known in the community in translation studies that translations normally are simpler, more normalized than original texts, and they have interference from the source language. So I wanted to measure these things, but now for post-edits compared to human translations. What we found is that these two types of translations are different in terms of translationist dimensions. So post-edits are simpler, so they have less lexical variety. They are more normalized in terms of length ratio, so the length of the sentences would follow the length of the source sentence, while human translators sometimes would make longer, sometimes shorter. And also we found that post-edits have more interference from the source language in the sense that the grammatical sequences, so the type of the word order, let's say, tends to be similar to that of the source sentence. So not good news for post-editing, I'd say. So this, I think, leads to a question for the community, which is whether post-editing could contribute to impoverish the target language, given that the lexical variety is lower, that there is more interference, and so on. At the same time, I'd like to mention here that it's not the fault of post-editing, I think, but of machine translation, because post-editing is basically limited in this regard because the starting point, which is machine translation, is also limited. But for example, if we look at interference, we found that this is lower in post-editing neural compared to post-editing statistical, precisely because interference is lower in neural than in statistical. Something else I think important is that we showed that human translation is better than post-editing in terms of lexical variety and interference, but previous studies have shown that the number of errors always is in human translation is bigger or the same as post-editing. But there is no study I've seen that they saw that post-edit has more errors than human. So I think here there is kind of a trade-off, right? That post-editing might be better suited for some domains like technical. So one thing is interference and lexical variety. On the one hand, human translation is better there, but on the other, if we look at errors in terminology, post-editing leads to more consistency. Okay, so this study we did, I think we can, if we now zoom out, it belongs to an area that I think is becoming, it's growing, which is analysis of translation characteristics. So we look at some translation characteristics in MT or post-editing and compare to human translation. For example, Van Massenhove 2019 showed that MT has less lexical diversity than human translations. Webster last year showed that MT decreases lexical richness and local cohesion. So more and more we see these findings are similar, more or less in line with each other. These were automatic analysis. There are also manual analysis that then they can go at particular features, like Farrell showed that there are empty markers in post-editing. Kenny and Winters show that the translator's voice is partially lost in post-editing. And Marco presenting today here, I just know what he's talking about because he's in the abstract, but not the findings. So he's looking at modal verbs, for example, in post-editing and in machine translation and in human translation and other aspects. So I'm gonna go a bit quickly here because I see time, I don't have much left. The next question we ask ourselves is whether post-edits are less creative than human translations. Okay, so when we talk about creativity, we have to consider that this is not only about originality, but also about effectiveness. To measure creativity, we based ourselves on the work by Baye and Hohenwachter, which I will summarize here. So what she does is annotates units of creative potential in the source text. So this is parts of the source text that probably would require some creativity to be translated. And then we take each of these units in the source text and we see how they are solved in the translation. So it could be that we have a reproduction if we have a literal rendering of the unit. It could be that we have a creative shift, and these are 3 types. So we could have modification when the source text is modified. For example, if I'm translating from Dutch into English, I could have in the Dutch and the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen, which is a university, and then in English I replace by a Trinity College because maybe it fits better for the reader. We could have concretization, where the source text is replaced by a more concrete example. For example, I have een beer in Dutch and I replace by a pint of Smithwick's. Or the opposite would be abstraction. So the source text is replaced by a generic one. So I have a particular beer that is known in the Netherlands and Bucks, but it wouldn't say much to a reader of an English translation. So I abstract to a beer. And so this would be reproductions and creative shifts about originality. And the other dimension is acceptability. So we also take into account errors. We work for this with a short story, Murder in the Mall, and we translate into Catalan with human translation, post-editing, and our literary adapted system. Then we have professional translators that annotate these units, and we see here in the story there were 48 units, and then we see how many were these units were translated creatively. We see 34 out of the 48 in the human translation, 29 in post-editing, and only 9 in machine translation. So we see that machine translation clearly tends to be more literal, while PE and human translation are more or less at the same level. We also measure errors for acceptability, and we see MTP and HT same level, machine translation 3 times more errors, clearly. So based on how creative and how many errors, we derive a creativity score. So here we see that human translation will be the most creative. We say 69%, post-editing a bit less, but the big gap here is between machine translation and post-editing. So due to time, I will not go into the details of this formula, but you can check our paper. And the last question would be, does post-editing affect the reading experience? This is really, I think, what we have to be interested, right, in. So again, it's the same book, and now we work with a narrative engagement scale that measures different aspects that are relevant, like narrative understanding, attentional focus, narrative presence, emotional engagement, and identification with characters. So an example of enjoyment, we also have enjoyment, like, did you enjoy this story? And translation reception. So did you realize this was a translation? So we measure all these things with the questionnaire, and we had 88 participants. So that we have native speakers of the target language, and each of them is going to get the translated story, either the human translation, post-edit, or machine translation. I'm only presenting narrative engagement here. This is between 1 and 7. This was a Likert scale, and we see human translation. The box is here. Post-editing is similar, and we see that machine translation is significantly lower, but we see that it's not that bad, right? Between 1 and 5, they are engaged here. You see 4.5, so it's more than the midpoint of the scale. So the interesting thing is that we found no significant difference between human translation and post-editing. Even before we have seen that post-editing has issues, the readers do not notice in the end. Another interesting thing, I think, is that MT, while it was significantly lower, it was not in some aspects like attentional focus, emotional engagement, and narrative presence. So the story was, there was a lot of action in the story. So maybe the translation is not that good, but it's good enough for the reader to get into the story. And then the reader might compensate. So here is a comment from one of the readers says, as I advance in my reading of the text, the translation deficiency have become less problematic. This is, the reader is aware that the translation is far from perfect, let's say, it's not that good, but it's good enough and the story is interesting enough that the reader decides to compensate for that. Okay, so these were the three actors, and now I'll go briefly through a summary and ideas for future. So briefly here, the machine, we see that new developments in machine translation bring consistent and notable improvements for the translation of fiction. The translator, we see that post-editing is faster, but professional translators prefer to translate from scratch because they feel less limited. As for the reader, translations post-edits are simpler and have more interference. They are less creative, but it did not affect the reading experience. Now I would like to finish with some ideas. So for the system, so these go from more straightforward to more blue sky here. So the first one is more data. So we still see that adding more data improves the translation, and I don't still see till what point. So we need to explore this thing, I think, and this is straightforward. The second one has to do with document level. So the systems I've presented have a very important drawback, is that they translate each sentence after each other in isolation. But we can now model multiple sentences at once, and this should help with cohesion and pronouns, for example. Third idea here is constrain the systems. So there were some experiments already several years ago that constrained systems to produce a translation with a desired rhyme. So this could give ideas to translate poetry. And this idea of constraining can be very general, can be, for example, anything that we can ask the system to do. For example, we could ask the system to give us more literal translations or less literal translations, or translations with less frequent words, or translation with more frequent words. So there could be this system of constraints with which we could ask the system for translations with different characteristics, let's say. Okay, about the translator, we see that post-editing is not, I don't think is viable for literary translation because it limits the translation. So an alternative here is interactive post-editing, but I'm not fully convinced this is going to work either. And something else we could do is empty as additional translation. So not something that you have to edit, but something that optionally you can look at to get ideas. So on this, I like to mention a bit more. So if I zoom out a bit here, we see that the successful use of technology in literary translation is that is geared towards exploration. And some examples are distant reading by Udale. So techniques that allows you to have a global view of the text you are translating, for example. So then maybe you get some ideas that you wouldn't get if you are only reading with your naked eye. Another one is computer assisted pan translation. So again, you can explore different possibilities when you have to translate a pan. And we see in surveys like that, those by Dimes, Slessor, or Rufo that presented yesterday, that general technology is used by literary translators because it allows them to explore, while translation technology is not so welcome because this translation technology is geared towards productivity, not exploration. So the problem with MT is that it's used with post-editing, so this is geared towards productivity. So it's faster, but it limits translators. So I think the idea here where we can explore more is try to use MT geared to discover new translations, not so much to make translators faster, but to give additional ideas. Okay, finally the reader. So now we are working with a more literary story. So the story we worked with before, it was a lot of action and drama. So maybe you got into the story and that's why MT worked quite well. Now we have a more literary one and we'll see whether the findings are different. It would be interesting, I think, to look at reading behavior. So with an eye tracking, but I see that someone, Coleman and colleagues, are presenting later today on this, so very interesting. And finally, we could have, I think this is a use case for raw machine translation, which is bilingual books for L2 readers. So if you want to access, we have an experiment, if you want to access something in English, you could have a machine translation output to help you understand the story. So the idea is you read in English and only use the raw MT to help you. So I had a demo of this, but I don't have time to show you. I want to close saying that there is a lot of evolving interest compared with when Besacier and us started in 2014. So now since 2019, you have workshops and panels in machine translation and translation studies. An example is today's conference, but also other types of players are showing interest, like the Goethe Institute or associations of writers, or even book fairs. Okay, so I'd like to close at that, thanking my co-authors, all participants in our study, especially the professional literary translators, and funding European Union and European Association for Machine Translation. Thank you.
Super, thanks so much, Antonio. Okay, so we only have another few minutes for questions. So I'm just going to, in fact, we have 2 minutes for questions. So I'm going to just pick one which popped up at me earlier, which was that the blur score is used quite heavily in rating machine translation quality. And the person who asked the question was wondering, how is the blur score calculated? Like, what does it actually take into consideration?
Yeah, good question, thanks. So yeah, the blur score is already almost 20 years in the community and it's very simple. So it's just how many, if you take sequences of consecutive words from 1 to 4, so you take all of them in the MT output and all of them in the human translation, and you check how many match. So it's basically how many sequences of words, what percentage of sequences of words match. So this, of course, is very limited. That's why we tend to use it only as an indication, and then we do a human evaluation.
That's great. And there's actually just been a follow-up question, which we have time to address. So how do you feel, or to what extent do you feel that this actually addresses the quality of the translation? Like how representative would you feel it is of the quality of a translation? Yeah,
okay. So the blur score, right? Yeah, it is to some extent. If you have, so what has been shown in the community is if the test set, so the text you evaluate on is sufficiently big, then it correlates to some extent with human judgments. But at the same time, with the progress in MT technology, with the state-of-the-art systems nowadays, the blur score is starting not to work that well. And there is a new generation of metrics that are way more complex that work better than the blur score.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks, you've, I'm sure, given everyone a lot to think about with your talk. You certainly have for me. So many thanks again. We'll now be moving into our various panels. So hopefully those of you who've who are joining online will have received the emails already for the correct panel. And those of you who are in the rooms, you just give me 1 minute to open up the Zoom rooms and get everything set up. I'm doing it remotely, so just give me 1 minute and I'll get everything set up. So thanks again to Antonio, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the day. Okay.
Thank you.